All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our crappie fishing edition of Ask an Angler. We got about 2 hours here. Got a lot of water to cover, so to speak. So what we're going to do first here is we're going to kind of go through the basics of just understanding the crappie. You know, what do them biologically, what they're doing, and then we're going to talk about how we're going to target them. So right now we're getting towards the end of February, going into March. Every part of the state was just dramatically affected by, sub-Arctic temperatures, which did a number, froze most bodies of water throughout the state to some degree. Dropped surface temperatures on some bodies of water by as much as 20 degrees, 15, 20 degrees, which fortunately it happened early enough. Water temperatures for the most part around the state were still in, the low 40s in most places as you move into like the southeastern part of the state or the southern parts that stay a little warmer. They're maybe up in the high 40s. And really what we're looking for most of our spring species or late winter species like crappie and white bass and black bass and white is we're looking at like 50 degrees. 50 degrees is our number. Everything above that, we're now, we're looking at pre-spawn, movement. And so we're going to go through the steps. So where those fish are out right now, the late winter period, they're out in that deeper water and they're waiting for those temperatures. And as the days get longer, that's what they're keying in on. It's not always so much, how hot is it? How many days in a row has it been hot? A lot of it is light cycles. So as the days get longer, that's, telling their biological clock to move around in the water column and, begin that migration process. So, and again, so as the course is live, in the chat bar, feel free at any point, ask your questions. We'll answer them as they go. When we get to the very end of the presentation, we'll do a recap and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. But if I'm moving too fast or I touched on something that you want to hear more about, at any point, feel free to just type over into the chat bar and we'll cover those subjects. These courses are meant to be more conversational because we want to provide you guys with the tips and tricks that you want to know, not necessarily what works best for me or what works best for somebody else. So don't hesitate, get into that chat bar if you got any questions throughout this. So crappie are in deep water in the winter. Deep water is a relative term. It's going to depend on max depth of the water. Where's your thermocline at? A pond, farm pond, small impoundment. Deep water might be 12 foot. So the area between their deep water and their spawning grounds, might be 30 feet. On a big reservoir, it might be a half mile. Crappie are, even a big crappie, 3-4 pounds. They're still a prey item. They're a predatory fish, but as they move out into those, deeper water, they're looking for cover. So brush piles, standing timber, anything like that, where they can conceal themselves, boulder fields, because the second that they get off of, some of those shallower waters in the fall and the sun and the springtime when they're, pushing up and moving back. So most people in the wintertime, you're targeting, fish out in main lake portions or out, maybe in the main arm or creek mouth of something, but you're fishing kind of the deepest part of the water that they're going to go to. So that's where the majority of the fish are at, right now. But we're going to see a quick climb, and the crappie spawn that we're going to be coming up on, it happens very quickly. It's, the bass spawn that can linger on. Different fish do different things. Crappie are schooling fish. They kind of, on a body of water, they all get up, they do their business, they get out. So spawning on each lake varies. We're going to talk about the water temperatures that they're looking for to spawn. But it's not a very long window for that real hot bite that that draws crappie anglers across the country out every spring, where it's just, it feels like you could just throw a hook into the water and you're hooking up on fish. Let's see, overholes are 13 or so deep would be dam and structure would be the dock that's there. So cover and structure are two terms that are a lot of times used interchangeably. Technically speaking, structure, if somebody's referring to structure in a body of water, the technical definition is the bottom, the bottom contour. So any changes, so hard ledges, ditches, that contour, that's all, the structure that makes up the bottom. And cover is anything that can conceal a fish. So down trees, vegetation, boulders, anything that's not part of the hard substrate of the bottom would be, but they're used interchangeably. So, if you're going into a bait shop maybe and you're asking and they're like, hey, yeah, we're catching fish over this in structure, just if you're not on the same page, just ask for clarification if somebody says cover or structure, because we're going to be using those terms a lot in this presentation. But when I'm referring to structure, I'm talking about the bottom. And when I'm talking about cover, I'm talking about, anything that could conceal that fish. So fish right now, they're holding, but we're getting close. Black crappie are going to make the move first. They're going to look anywhere between like 50 and 54 degrees. So their window sometimes is like that second week of March. Now we've gotten really cold, but we have pretty consistent temperatures over the next 10 days. So you're looking for those overnight lows to start increasing and be consistent. If you get one day that pushes through, like one big north wind, and maybe the high for the day was 55, but the overnight low went from 45 to 35 or 27, something like that. Not a lot, but if there's a few overnight lows like that in a row, what you really want to look for, to determine, all right, water temps are moving up. Look at those overnight lows, not so much the daytime highs. Because when the air temperatures are stabilizing overnight, that's helping with the prolonged light period during the day, that while the surface temperatures may be fluctuating from, sunlight and other factors, those fish know that water, the consistency has started. So they're going to start, working their way up. Now, where crappie look to spawn, they want to spawn on hard surface. So in an ideal situation, that's going to be cleared gravel or rock that's going to be protected by cover in shallow water, anywhere from like 1 to 8 feet. And if you don't have that, so like some ponds, let's say you farm pond fish, or you're in a small impoundment, there's lots of vegetation. It seems like you got a lot of muck or clay and you're not hitting that. They can spawn on the tops of things. So they might look for logs or things like that, but they want to lay their eggs on that hard structure. So they're going to follow, the structure up and either look for the top of a log to spawn on, or ideally they're going to have a gravel bed or riprap. So when you're targeting spawning areas, especially public access, if you don't have a boat, if you go to a body of water to crappie fish to hit the spawn or just, hit the pre-spawn, your dam is your best bet. Just because that's the ideal habitat that those fish are looking for. Most dams are accessible to bank anglers and maybe some of the other areas of the lake that have the similar, ecosystem for spawning that fish is looking for. You might not be able to get to that from the bank. So for bank anglers, docks and riprap on dams, anything that's moving up where you're going to have that rock, because that's what they're looking for. They want that hard bottom to spawn. So most spawning for crappie, especially white crappie, you're looking at the upper 50s. So 56 to 59 degrees is kind of a happy range in there. And like I said, black crappie are probably going to move up first. Ponds and things like that, they're pretty, a small body of water like that, those fish come up real quick and then they dip that out. But most of the time it's black crappie. Black crappie favor a little bit clearer water, cleaner water. Most ponds, can kind of sustain that. And then those white crappie, a lot of times you don't get a lot of cross spawn. So the black crappie have already moved out of those spawning areas when those white crappie come up, just because those temperatures are just a little bit different. But they're both looking for the same type of habitat to spawn on. So that's where we really kind of get that longer window of spawning activity from crappie, because for 4 or 5 days in an area, you're just hitting fish after fish after fish after fish. And then it's slowly tapering off after the fish have, the female fish have laid their eggs, they've got out of there. Male crappie provide parental care to the fry, and then leading up to the eggs being dropped. So the majority of fish that are caught during the spawn are male fish, because that's their job. But after the females have dropped their eggs and they've been fertilized and those males are protecting the beds, they are no longer looking to feed. The bite continues, but that's because of, protective instinct. They're going to all they want to do is injure and kill. They're not actually looking to eat. So you'll notice that the pre-spawn period at the very beginning, moving into that spawn, it's like fish are hitting it, they're eating, they're holding it, the bites are super aggressive. And then you get into the spawn and it's like, man, there's a bunch of fish up here, but the bite's different. And then you get post-spawn and it's like you're getting bit a lot, but all that fish is doing is grabbing the back of the tail, grabbing the quick bite. So downsizing your hooks and the profile of your bait as the spawn kind of wears on, you're going to hook more fish. You're still going to be in a lot of fish because they're there. It's just they're not looking to eat. So that bite, if they're holding on to it, it's a split second before they spit it out because all they wanted to do is just get it out of the way. So that's kind of the very basic overview of fish moving from deep water to shallow water and what they're going to look for, to get from point A to point B. They're not, they're going to move up a little bit and they're going to start feeding just like bass do. So they're going to start looking for those quick depth changes. So if you have, let's say you have the back of a creek, so it goes in and out at the mouth, there's some, either artificial structure or a cover that's been dropped down there like spider blocks, or you have natural things that have been dropped in the water, or just natural, structure and cover in the body of water that wasn't produced, by somebody, either the wildlife department or other people putting, artificial habitat or natural habitat in a body of water. But they're going to hover over that. They're going to look for the quickest route. So from that deep water to the shallow water, when you're looking to target an area to fish, if you know where fish are at in the winter, here's all my brush piles or things like that. This is where these fish are holding. The path in which they're going to look to go to spawn is going to be those really, really quick depth changes. So the bottom is maybe 20 feet deep. Those fish are holding in 15 feet of water in a brush pile, in a down tree, in some type of concealment. And they're going to want to look for that, that point or that ledge to go up. And that's kind of where they're going to spend that week, 2, maybe even 3 feeding and getting ready for that spawn. They're going to be gorging. So for both bank anglers and boat anglers, that's kind of the best time to really get in on like slip cork action, where you still need to target deeper water, but you want to keep it in the strike zone. Crappie don't get spread out a lot, especially at this time of year. They're in pretty tight packed schools. As they come out of those winter patterns, they start gathering. So they're all going to be at a very certain depth, all kind of grouped together. So it's important, to be able to manage that. And then, they look for that next step up when they actually do push up to spawn. And that's where the game gets real quick, because those females come in, they drop their eggs, they're out. So catching post-spawn females up in shallow water is not very common. They just drop their eggs. They might hit something running back, but they're not going to hang around. So once they do it, they're kicking right back out to those transition areas, maybe even out to deeper water to recuperate for a few days. And then they'll get back into, a feeding habit, but it's going to be out in that deeper water where those males are going to hold up tight for a much longer period. And that's what people really get excited about when crappie fishing gets good, where it's just left and right action. That's what's happening. It's not, a byproduct of, all these fish right here, they're feeding actively. They're feeding out in that deeper water in those quick transition areas. And then as they push in to spawn, now the bite has become, predatory as opposed to feeding. They're trying to protect their fry. So let's see. What time during the spawn with crappie short striking with tiny jigs, like ice fishing jigs, work theoretically? The way that I fish for crappie, and I'm always going to try to fish with as small of a hook and bait presentation as possible. And I do that with most fishing, no matter the species, because I would rather catch more fish and have to weed through, maybe non-desired species or non-targeted species or smaller versions of the species I'm going at, because you're going to weed through enough fish that you'll still hit big fish. What happens is you start adding like a bigger profile bait. So let's find something here that's a little big for, a small crappie, a 9, 10, 11 inch crappie, something like this, where you have this is, 3.5 inch, little bait fish presentation, little shad imitator, Where if you were to throw this on a hook, yeah, this is gonna pick up your bigger fish, but wherever you're putting that hook at, like if I'm gonna fish this in deeper water, I'm probably gonna be vertically suspended. So that big profile bait is gonna pick up bigger fish, but you're also gonna eliminate catching the majority of the fish that are there, which are going to be smaller, but there's nothing stopping that bigger fish from eating that little tiny bait. So crappie fishing, always good to, run small if you're looking to catch numbers. If you're looking to just specifically target trophy sized crappie, you're going to want to stick to, 3-inch baits with the hook a little bit farther back. So, that crappie's mouth on a 9-inch fish is like that, but then on a, 12-inch fish, it's like that. So inhaling that quick and being able to set the hook, that would be the only time that I would really recommend using bigger profile baits, is if you were just specifically trying to target big fish. You have no interest in catching your limit or anything like that. You just want to catch a couple like trophy fish, larger profile bait. But there's nothing to stop catching those bigger fish with smaller profile baits. You're just going to have to weed through a lot more, smaller fish. So I don't know if Jacob, if that answers the question exactly for you. But that's just kind of my philosophy, to each their own on how they want to catch fish. I just want to catch as many fish as possible. If big fish are mixed in, it's a bonus. But I'm always just looking to catch as many fish as possible. So things, what a standard crappie box might look like for somebody, as those fish move up, things that are like baby shad imitation. So, you look at something like that where you have your different jig head, your different, colored baits, and putting them on, just a jig head. So we're going to kind of talk about what the different presentations that you can use, because there really is no wrong way to crappie fish, especially during the spawn, because the fish are so active and that's what they're looking for. So there's several different options. The most commonly used style of fishing that I see around the state for people that are, targeting crappie is using live bait, using minnows. Artificial bait's never going to fully replace a live minnow. But, artificial, if you give the right presentation with those types of baby shad and things like that, odds are there's not going to be a huge difference in, I was catching more fish with minnows than this. It might just be how those, baits in the water reacting based on your presentation, because obviously a live minnow is probably going to be heavier on your hook than, what one of those little soft plastics are. So that's going to affect, how that's moving and what fish you're looking for. Well, the most important thing with crappie, when you're targeting them, you have to be above them. Crappie, the way that they're built, their eyes are on the top of their head like this. So they were made, those black crappie, they got the nice speckle, they live in clear water. So they have more, of that pattern on them. So when bait fish are above them and they're looking, they see down, that black crappie, his back is kind of mimicking that clear water vegetation and things that are on the bottom, whereas your white crappie are going to have the dark, green band across the top. But because they typically inhabit, more stained water and dirty water, they don't need that, bright color. Because when fish live in stained water and clay colored water, they're not getting the light penetration to come in. So they're naturally a little lighter in color. If you ever have caught a fish in a super like clay stained pond that's usually clear, and all of a sudden you pull a bass out or a crappie and it looks like it's ghost white, that's just, them reacting to not getting that sunlight. So they're trying, the backs of fish, if you think about it, it's always from above, is it dark like the bottom? And then if a predator is below, it's light like the sky when they're looking up. But their eyes are right on the top of their head. So if you put baits below them, especially if you're casting and retrieving and running, if you're running from behind the fish or underneath the fish, you're more likely to spook it and they're not going to go down. But crappie are very lazy. They're not a quick, aggressive, go chase down a bait. So dead sticking, where you're just leaving, the bait there, and baits, like these soft plastics, they have that little tail, and you can just see when I'm holding on to it with no water that it's just subtly vibrating. You put that in water, this tail is constantly moving, even though you're not moving it. That current's moving it. So vertical presentations for crappie are you know, the easiest, most consistent way to catch fish. Air run on the darker water with two-tone jig colors. You know, crappie are a unique species in, you know, what they're going after during this time period. So like I said earlier, those male fish, once they have spawned and they're protecting those fry, that's where those brighter colors, especially in darker water, are going to elicit more reactionary strikes. But again, they're not trying to eat that bait. They're just trying to injure it and get it away from their fry. So the opportunity to be able to set the hook diminishes. So you have to be much more keen on, you know, sensitive bites. And again, because crappie feed upward, a lot of times it's not a thump, thump, thump bite. It's a rise bite. So they're grabbing that bait and it's going into their mouth and they're hitting it like this. Well, your line's going here. Well, they're picking your line up, which is causing slack. So a lot of times if you're fishing with a bobber, it's not one of these under the water. It's this. Slowly falls. When you see that, reel up and hammer down the hook, because that's just going to be that rise bite. So always depth control, depth control, depth control is the most important thing when crappie fishing. Even when they get up shallow, you still want to keep that bait either level with them or above them. They get into 2 feet of water, that's where downsizing a 32nd ounce hook, a 1/64th ounce, you know, jig head, or a tiny piece of split shot, and just using like a plain shank hook, you know, to bait your hook. Another probably less commonly used option for fishing for crappie in transition zones and into the spawn, not so much the deeper water because they're going to be elevated up off the bottom. But as they push up and they're moving up those, you know, into that shallow water, well, in these areas like this, when you're dragging your bait, going with a drop shot. So a drop shot is just a hook that's, you know, tied onto your line with a Palomar knot, and then you run the line back through the top of the eyelid to run down, and it connects to your weight. And you could actually use this where this is going to run, and you keep this on the bottom. So I know that I'm at about 12 inches. So reeling this uphill, if I need, you know, to move it, if I'm not just on a boat holding it vertically and just letting it touch the bottom and then keeping the line tight, so it's just right there and pulsating. If I actually want to reel it back into the bank, this is going to keep this at, you know, for about 6 to 8 inches. It's going to drop a little bit as it's, you know, trying to work its way back up. But that's a great way to kind of regulate your bait. You know, when they get into super shallow water, especially in clear water, if that bobber's sitting, especially not a slip cork, but if you're just using just a basic clip-on bobber, something like, you know, something like this, you're on this, well, you know, you might only want your bait that far down, especially if you're fishing really small impoundments like your farm pond, neighborhood pond, small city lakes, things like that, where those fish might get up into a foot of water to spawn. Whereas on a deeper reservoir, they might be out in, you know, shallow water, and that's 4 feet. So then using a bobber, you're dropped down, you know, 18, 24 inches, and you're up above them. That makes it really simple. It's a great way to fish. You can bobber jig. If I'm ever using a fixed bobber where it's not a slip cork, I want to be casting into the wind. You know, especially on like the north sides. If you ever have like a north dam, you know, that's the riprap. That's where they're looking to spawn. They're looking to move up to it. So I can cast to a set depth, knowing that, you know, I'm going to figure out exactly where those fish are and at what depth. And then once I get to that, I kind of know visually when I'm casting where my zone is at. And I let that wind do the work for me. And I just slowly just keep, you know, that slack between the clip of this and my rod tip, keep that up, and this will just slowly work its way to the bank. And that's a great way to catch fish during right at the end of the pre-spawn, right as they're getting ready to push up. That's a great way to keep it in the zone. But if you're on a small pond and they're in a foot of water, so you only want to hold it like 4 inches below, you might get, especially clear water, those fish can see that bobber banging around up at top of it. It might make them a little bit more finicky. So approaching it from a bottom up approach where your bait's still up off the bottom and you're using that weight instead. So it's kind of like a reverse bobber technique, but most people drop shot for bass. So it's not a typical crappie technique, but it can be very effective in small bodies of water for bank anglers. Now we talked about slip corking. So, you know, your slip on a slip cork, you have a fixed piece, you have your bobber stop. This is one that's just a pre-packaged one that slips right onto your line. You cinch it tight, and then you cut the excess. And then you have your float and then a bead, and all the bead's doing is the hole on the end of that is big enough to, overcome, like if you just have a singular hook down, especially like a bait holding hook, if you're fishing a live bait, you don't have a jig head on. So it just helps with casting. This is going to run all the way down to your hook before you throw it back out. Well, if you don't put that bead on there, that runs right over the top of your, the eye hole of your hook, and you can mess up the presentation of your bait. So, just putting a bead on that. Now, these can become cumbersome to throw through, the eyelids of a guide. So just on just a standard 6'6" rod, these eyelids, that's gotta, it's gotta run through, and it creates abrasion and things like that, and it can fall off. So, but it offers you the luxury of moving. You can move it even though it's snug. It's not going to move when you're casting as much, maybe a centimeter or two. But if you ever need to fix your depth, it's quick and convenient to move that bobber stop up and down the line to accurately control your depth. Now, if you happen to know what the depth is, like let's say you're fishing a small body of water, or you're bank fishing, or even if you're boat fishing, but you know where those fish are, where your crappie hole is at. Another option that you can do with that slip fork is cut your line. So, wherever your line's at, your main tag, and it's not tied to a hook, it's not tied to anything, pull that out and either take a spool, of the same pound, the same exact line that you have on. You could downsize a little bit if you wanted to and use a leader. It doesn't really make a difference. But for this tying, if you have 6 pound mono on, tie 6 pound mono to it. But if you know that exact depth, so the bobber stop right here, see how small that is? That's just a knot. That's not something that's slipped on. This is 2 pieces of the same line tied on with a double uni knot. Well, if I know exactly what my depth is, that low profile knot right there, just like drop shot fishing, if you're tying on like a fluorocarbon leader to braid or something like that, and you want more than 3 feet, so your actual knot is going through the top guide of your rod and then, going down towards your reel, that's got to go through your guides on the way out. It's going to create abrasion and things like that. So having that real low profile on that, if you know exactly what your bait is, a little less cumbersome to cast out there. You probably aren't going to get as many, you go to cast it, and then all of a sudden you didn't get the distance because that, where did you go? This one. That's bigger. It's going to get caught on your guide. So that's just something. It's definitely not as convenient. You have to know what that depth is, because once you tie that knot, that's where your bobber stop is. So, you could leave that on there and then just trim your line if you're too deep and move. But it's just an easy way once you get on fish and you know where they're at. Or another vertical presentation, especially if you're using like a really small jig, but you're fishing in enough water with your slip float, or and you're coming out of this, putting, this is a 1/4 ounce. This is probably a little bit too much, but if you wanted to get to really deep water in a big reservoir, then when you tie on a lure, when you're tying on a jig head that's like 1/32 little tiny head. Well, if this was all you had and you wanted to, let's say, get this down to 15 feet, right? So fish are in 12 to 15 foot off the dam, you're throwing your slip cork out, and that's all that's tied onto it. Well, if you're using, especially if you're using monofilament line, which is going to have some memory, and the waves and the current under that, it is going to take forever for this thing to descend and then keep enough line, because it's so light, from kind of spinning underneath your cork, which, again, crappie, they come in, they get it, they're off before maybe you even knew you had a bite. So adding extra weight, if you want to use a really small profile bait or a real small profile hook with that bait at a deeper depth, adding weight up your line just to make sure when that thing hits the water that it's dropping straight down to your depth. You have tight line between, contact with your bait and your rod tip, because that's important with crappie fishing, because again, those rise bites are really subtle. And if you don't have contact with your bait, there's any type of slack in your line, you miss those bites. So that's one way to stay away from, missing finicky bites, rise bites, anything like that. Put a little bit of weight if you're having any issues. And again, have a few different sizes of slip corks. Like these are obviously very, very, this is a very small, versus like that bobber. And then, wherever that bigger slip cork went, it's got to be able to stay afloat. So you put too much weight on it, it's going to suck it under. So these little tiny ones are great in like smaller, if you're targeting them in really shallow water, on small ponds or things like that. Once they're up to that 4, 6, 8 foot, then I can tie my 32nd ounce jig on, because I may be only 4 feet below my float, just long enough that it's a pain to cast if I'm connected. Because when you connect that to the line, this is a micro rod, so this is only a 4'6" rod. Well, even if I was to clip this right up at the top, and I have my little hook that's tied on down here, that's not 4 feet. So you're looking at, you can't cast that, right? So your hook's hanging down here, your bobber's weight, it becomes cumbersome to cast. So slip corks, even in shallow water, are helpful, because you can run this little tiny guy on a smaller cork and it holds it upright. It's not going to, it's enough to keep that upright. But if you get out into bigger reservoirs, deeper water, it becomes much more difficult to hold small profile, weight on your jig head to indicate bites. So, and again, all these can be used with your minnow, with whatever. So just baits in general, again, I showed the box of all the different types of, baby shad. Obviously, crappie are, primarily a fish-eating fish. So their primary prey targets are going to be, juvenile, bluegill, small juvenile shad, things like that. They're not feeding off the bottom like bass. They're not coming up to the surface. So they're not looking for terrestrials. They're not, looking for crustaceans and things like that as much. Where some areas, maybe some fish have adapted to the environment, they might eat crustaceans there. But overall, fish are holding up off the bottom, and they're looking upward, and they're looking for bait fish. So anything in a bait fish imitation is great. There's tons of different versions. Some people prefer, a marabou jig, something like this. This, again, in the water is mimicking a bait fish, just a different style presentation. It's all built in. There's no soft plastic, so it's one piece. That's more convenient for some people. If it's working, great. You get bit too many times, even with crappie on one of these, that might only last 4 or 5 bites before it does enough damage up to where it holds on the bait, the little bait holder up here, that little clip that kind of holds that on. You get a few bites, all of a sudden it wears that plastic down. You got to change out. So some other, let's see, we got a big box around here. Some classic panfish starter kits have basic things like these. These are all fairly generic. And again, these brighter colors like this, after the male fish have spawned, they then become a lot more attracted to, loud colors. So that's where your pinks and your chartreuses and everything else. Now, leading up to the spawn, they're looking to target their prey species. So their prey species is going to be something that's more naturally colored. So, sticking to whites, we had this last freeze killed off a lot of threadfin. Threadfin, shad, which make up a pretty consistent diet for crappie in a lot of bodies of water, they've died off. So is something in kind of that mimicking color with the blue and the yellow, are they still going to target that? That's for us as anglers to find out now once this thaw begins, and we really kind of see the new system of, forage to prey base from your apex predator all the way down to your microorganisms, how the shad die off, which happens naturally during the winter. This one was just excessive. How that's going to affect, all of our species, what colors they're targeting. But definitely pre-spawn, when they're looking to feed, stick to more natural colors, or stick to live bait. Then once those male fish have spawned, that's when you're going to start seeing, these hot pinks and oranges and chartreuses get bit more often. It's just, are you quick enough to set that hook? Because if you're sitting on a dock with a bunch of people and, oh man, everybody's getting bit, they're using this, but they can't set the hook. That's because, again, those fish aren't feeding. They're just looking to move it away. But in stained water, which is most of Oklahoma, or a dinge to it, if you're not in, the far southwestern or far southeastern where you really can visibility from your boat or from the bank, you can see the bottom in 4 foot of water, 5 foot of water, things like that. If you're not that clear, then you're probably dingy, and post spawn, those brighter colors are going to be effective. Now, in the very crystal clear water, your natural colored baits are still going to be effective because the fish can obviously see it. And again, it's just looking to defend its fry. But definitely in any type of stained clay, dingy water, once those male fish have spawned, switch your artificial back to loud colors, loud, bright colors, even like small crankbaits in bright colors. So, something in a red, like a little tiny deal like this. It's just enough to get that fish to go after it. Because your minnows, like live bait, is going to become less effective once those fish have dropped their eggs, and the males have completed their spawning portion. So live bait and naturally colored baits from right now out in deeper water, over the next couple of weeks, you'll start to see those fish migrate off of that deep cover to those transition structure points. And that's all dependent on your body of water. So, those fish are looking for shallow, safeguarded waters, which is typically the backs of coves, creeks, and ponds. It's going to be, those shallow bays, or maybe you have the main creek channel that goes through a small pond. They're hovering out over that in their deep water, and they're just looking to get right up on that shelf. And now they're back into, 3 to 1 foot of water. They're going to drop along those. So targeting right now, you're hitting them with those minnows and naturally colored whites, thread fin colors, subtle, like a light blue, something like that. And then as they get up into that really shallow water, then you can start with the cast and retrieve, with grubs. One, especially in farm ponds or smaller impoundments where those fish are super concentrated and they don't have the luxury of seeing a lot of, shad populations. Most small ponds, you might have some shiners in them or things like that. And then there's mosquito fish and other forage based, but those crappie in a farm pond, they might be looking at bluegill as their deal. So little pre-molded bluegill baits like this, little paddle tail, just nice, slow, steady retrieve. With most species of fish, when you're fishing, but especially with crappie, you can't fish slow enough. Again, eyes on the top of the head. So you want that bait. Depth control is, crucial when crappie fishing, but slowing down. That's why I prefer smallest jig heads I can use, or no jig head and maybe just a piece of split shot, because I want that bait to be able to move a little bit if I'm casting and retrieving, but I don't want it radically dropping to the bottom. And then in order to keep it at the proper depth, I'm now having to retrieve it faster, and the odds of that fish tearing off after it. If I'm just slowly turning over the crank on my reel, in some of the cheaper reels, like if you're just getting like a basic setup at Walmart or something like that, the gear ratio on that reel might be like 4.2 to 1. So for every rotation, you're only getting 4 spins, which might only pick up this much line. If you have a nice expensive reel or a really fast gear ratio reel that's telling you it's, the most common is like 6.2 to 1. But then you get up to like, 7.5 to 1, things like that. That means even if you're reeling incredibly slow, one full rotation spinning, 7 times around it, well, that's picking up more and more line, which means in the water, even though you don't feel it because you think you're reeling slow, this thing's hauling through the water faster than it should be. So slow, if you're not fishing vertically, if you're going to cast and retrieve for crappie, I recommend using a slower ratioed reel so that you can really, and then a lighter bait to keep it. So I showed it a little bit earlier, but this little 4'6" microlight rod, I love this for ponds. Just because I got enough up here with 4-pound test on that even a 32nd ounce jig head, if I was to put this on my, 6'6", 7-foot bass rod with 10-pound test, 12-pound test, 8-pound test. I can't cast this. I'm not going to get any distance because the rod tip's not helping me. But throwing this little 32nd ounce out there, and the ratio on this is 5.2 to 1, so it's a little bit slower than a common model, means that I can just barely do this right when my lure hits the water. So it's slowly descending down as I'm starting my retrieve, and it's eventually going to find that happy medium where it's kind of level and then even traveling back upwards to me at the boat or the bank. But I'm able to reel really slow and keep my bait right in that depth zone while casting and retrieving. So casting and retrieving for crappie becomes very, technical, just because depth control is so important. That's why bobber fishing, float fishing, and then vertical, either dead sticking with spider rigs or just holding on to your rod, are the most effective for catching crappie consistently, because it gives you the most opportunity at those bites. But during this pre-spawn period and right before the spawn, as those fish have pushed up as shallow as they're going to get, but they're still in feeding mode, when they get to that point, man, cast and retrieve, you can't beat it. I mean, it's fun to watch a bobber, but it's not like panfish or a catfish that whoop, goes under. Sometimes it's just that rise hit. So it might only wobble just like that. You turn your head, you missed your bite, and who knows, maybe that's a 2-3 pound crappie that was sitting right there. So cast and retrieve that last week of the pre-spawn is as effective as any technique if you can keep it at the right depth. So smaller rods, very light action rods, or you could use, you go the other way, you could get a really, really light action, like 7-foot rod. But those are more effective when you're just vertically, you just need to get your rod out away from your boat or the bank and then just vertically fish at a certain depth. But for casting and retrieving in small bodies of water, 5'6" rods and under, all the way down to, your 4'2" rods. And then anything smaller than that, you're getting to ice fishing setups. But 4'2" to 5'6" is a really good happy range. No more than 4-pound test, because again, especially if you're using monofilament, which I like to use monofilament for cast and retrieve for crappie. Monofilament is buoyant and it's water absorbent, whereas fluorocarbon is going to sink on me. But I want really, really light 2-pound, 4-pound mono, because that little tiny jig head right there, this is fluorocarbon on this, but I use this rod mostly for, my vertical presentation. And then I have the same exact rod set up, spun with monofilament to use for cast and retrieve. But that little guy right there, if I casted that out with this fluoro and I started to try to reel in, well, the line as it's moving away from my rod tip, which is, your mono is going to kind of sit on top of the water. And especially with this little tiny guy, it's going to help keep it up. But if you have the fluoro, it's going to start to sink on you, and then reeling super slow, I lose my depth control. But the problem is with mono, if you use 6-pound test, which most people consider pretty light line, if you put 6-pound test on that and try to cast it multiple times, if you're not perfect with loading the rod tip, and then especially with the, an open face spinning reel, if you're not perfect with letting your finger go and timing it with the snap of the rod tip, line twist, line twist, line twist. And even if you make the cast accurately and you don't get the line twist, well, that mono still has tons of memory in that line, even when it hits the water. So the heavier it is, I'm losing that contact with my bait as it's slowly moving. So if you're crappie fishing, especially with cast and retrieve, 2-pound, 4-pound test on open face spinning reels so that you can keep your drag really loose. Crappie aren't that big, and the majority of the fish that you're going to be catching are going to be between 8 and 12 inches. Once you start getting between 12 and 14, you're finding, some bigger, probably female fish. And then anything over 14-inch for a crappie, 14 to 18 inches, you're looking at those trophy fish. You're starting to get to the 1.5 pound, 2-pound, 3-pound range of those fish. So, but it doesn't take much. Their mouths aren't overly hardened, things like that. You're using a sharp hook point. So you can get the hook set without needing that stiff rod, tight line to do that, to really hammer that hook home. So soft tip on the rod, light action, very low pound test. And if you're using 2-pound test and you're breaking fish, like if you're breaking off 12-inch fish on 2-pound test, first change your, turn down your drag. Once you set that hook, that fish should be able to go. But, again, even a 2-pound crappie, you're probably going to have a lot of control over it, especially, your 8 to 12-inch fish. You shouldn't have any problem, even if drag is really loose. So if a 1, 2, 3-pound fish hits it and then it runs with it, now you're playing the fish and you got to wear the fish out. Anything else, even if your drag is super loose, they're not heavy enough that when you set the hook that it's going to, the drag's going to go and you don't get a good hook set. You'll still get that hook buried, but you've opened up the opportunity to catch a bigger fish and let it run. So, if you're not using vertical presentations, so anything that you're trying to move through the water column without it being attached, to something that afloat at the top or anything like that, light line. And then even for vertical presentation, especially in clear water, fluorocarbon, if you have, let's see here, this one's set up on a drop shot, but this is 10-pound braid. So this is a 6'6" rod. And then it's just spooled with 10-pound braid and it's tied to a 6-pound fluorocarbon leader. It's set up for drop shotting for bass right now. But, for a vertical presentation, this same deal will work. Now, instead of tying on a 6-pound leader, so my leader knot's right here. It's about 3 feet above the hook, about 2.5 feet above the hook, and about 3 feet from my weight. I don't want to do any more than that. As you can see, I have my hook down here attached and my knot's about right here, middle of the rod. So I can reel this up, almost to the top eyelid and cast without having, excess hanging. So you can either do straight fluorocarbon or braided with the fluoro leader. I mean, fluorocarbon's expensive. It's not ideal to use as a main line if you're just, a casual recreation, get out on the water a few times a year, something like that, because it's expensive. It's going to sit on that reel. So using a very light braid, 6 to 10-pound braid, and then attaching, a 2 or 4-pound fluorocarbon leader in clear water for a vertical presentation, just so those fish, may or may not see that braided line. Or again, mono. But anytime you're using monofilament line, make sure that the size of the line, whatever that mono is set for, matches your reel classification, your rod classification, and on that rod, what is, the lure weight classification. So in every rod, as long as it's not a blank rod deck that you plan on, making your own or sending it somewhere to be made, every single one of them is going to tell you either on the front portion of the rod or the back what the action is right here. So like on this, it's telling me the line weight is 2 to 6 pounds. So I don't want to exceed 6 pounds on this and 2 pounds. I'm not getting smaller than that. So 2 to 6. Most bass rods will say 6 to 10, 8 to 12, things like that. So that's where the longer rods that you're using, if you're using bass rods to crappie fish, that's where, if you're using monofilament, you really want to tailor that to your setup, because that mono just creates the memory. So if you're using too light of a lure and too heavy a mono, you're going to get just these little subtle bends in the line when it's in the water, and you're not keeping good contact with your hook, which is of utmost importance with the crappie. I mean, rise bites, especially on cast, it happens on cast and retrieve a lot. If you're, real slow, so you're barely moving that lure, but all of a sudden, that crappie has all the time, it's barely moving. So it comes up and it grabs it, but it's kind of still moving upwards. So you're reeling, but because that lure is so small, and maybe you have a little bit of that kink in the line with that mono, you don't feel anything. You just feel like you're still just slowly moving. And then all of a sudden, maybe your line just kind of starts to drift away from you and that fish has it in his mouth. Well, that's great during the pre-spawn. That doesn't work during post-spawn or immediately during this, while they're spawning, right after the spawn when they're protecting, because they're going to throw that. All they're looking to do is hit it. So they're going to spit that out. So if you're using monofilament for crappie fishing, even if you're using a vertical presentation, you shouldn't be exceeding 6 pounds of your line test. But 2 to 4 pounds is going to be much more helpful, because your 32nd ounce jig head that you want to get down there, well, with 2 pound mono, it keeps the line taut, so you remain contact with your bait. But if you're using 6 pound mono on that little guy, you're not you're going to miss a ton of fish that have hit your bait, engulfed it, and you never even knew that it was there. Brady Leck, but where would I find pre-spawn crappie, especially in highland reservoirs where it's a little deeper and has a lot of places for them to be? So again, deep is a relative term. For crappie, they're deep for crappie, again, is going to be fairly close to where their spawning habitat is. So if it's in the back of a creek or, up on ledges that on protected sides of points or things like that, they're not going to go too far out over deep water. They're looking for, cover in that deep water, brush piles and things like that. But the second they get off of those shallow shelves where they are still prey to largemouth bass and things like that, they move out into that deeper water. Now they're low man on the totem pole in most cases. So those fish aren't going to go too far, away from, where they're shallow water. So big ledges, big drop-offs off of bluffs and things like that, that have quick areas up to spawn, that's the deep water. So when you're targeting pre-spawn winter habitat crappie, they're over deep water, but they're holding somewhere in the water column. So you might be over 30 feet of water, but the fish are at 12 feet in the water column, and there's a big, cedar tree that's dumped there, and they're kind of intermixed in that cedar tree, but you're wanting to put your bait, again, right at the top of that cover. You don't want to get down too far into it, one for snagging purposes, but again, you kind of want to catch crappie down the Christmas tree. So start picking off those top ones, and then as the bite dies down, but you're still, especially if you're in a boat, you can mark fish, and you see fish that are farther down that cover, start up top, pick those fish off, and then slowly descend your way down to attempt to pick those fish off. But that's the deep water that you want to look for, is right off of a point, right off of a ledge, with any type of, it could be boulders or vegetation. They might not necessarily, crappie aren't always necessarily in brush piles. A lot of them, they live in hollowed out logs and in vegetation flats over deep water, things like that. It depends on the body of water, but know that when they're in deep water, they're not too far from wherever their spawning ground is. It's not like bass that may run all the way to an offshore hump or an offshore island. So they're covering open water, because a 4-pound bass probably isn't getting eaten, in open water, not in Oklahoma. We don't have pike. We don't have muskie. We don't have things that can attack. So crappie, even an 8-inch, 10-inch crappie, if you have a good farm pond for bass or something like that, but you got some crappie in it, throw a 10-inch crappie out there. If you catch it, tail hook him with whatever hook you caught him on and throw him out, and watch a 2-3 pound bass come eat it. It doesn't take an 8-9 pound bass to eat a crappie. That mouth opens up. So crappie are prey most of the time. So when they get out over that deep water, they're hovering tight to whatever they can conceal themselves with in an area that's more comfortable for them, because they want to be closer to that thermocline. So they're looking for that deeper water, but it's very close to a transition point. So when you're targeting that deep water, if you know where their spawning grounds are, just work your way out from there and find that first real structure change. But they want to look for those quick, I can get to deep water real quick, I can get to shallow water real quick, but there's not this huge migration path of them following. So not quite sure if that answered your question. Throw in another one if I didn't, but I think that got you. The next one, cast and retrieve tiny jig heads under a really small bobber to maintain depth, or is the mono typically enough to float the jig? No, the mono is not going to float the jig. It just, your mono line has some buoyant properties that are going to keep, farther away from your hook. It's going to kind of keep that straight line from your rod tip to your point of contact at the hook. What will happen with fluoro is it'll start to bend this way to go up because the line is sinking down. So suspending a jig at a certain depth under, a fixed clamp stick bobber, you can use round bobbers. I prefer stick bobbers, especially with crappie, because again, rise bites. With a round bobber, that's real hard, especially if it's way away from you, to see any type of, turn. The stick will start to fall if they rise bite. And that's really bobber jigging for bank anglers probably is the #1 technique of most anglers. It's very effective, but it keeps you at a fixed depth, which means wherever those fish are at, there's a zone, and you'll figure that out. You'll cast out. You'll be like, I want to cast 20 feet off the bank. The fish are at about 15 feet away from me. And so I'm just going to let that swing into them at a fixed depth. But then once you get past that, now you're deeper than they are. Because again, if you're fishing from the bank, you're fishing uphill. You're casting to deep water. You're working your lure back up this way. Whereas when you're in a boat, you have the luxury where if you're using a fixed bobber casting towards the bank, and I know the bank, the depth is 2 feet. So I put, I'm maybe 3 feet below my bobber, 2.5 feet below my fixed bobber. I'm casting just inside of that. And then I'm working the bobber back to the boat. But now this time I'm working it the other direction. So that bait is now getting into deeper water at a fixed depth, which I may have missed some of the fish if I was on the bank when I'm coming back this way. Because once I get too shallow, I'm coming up through them. And that way, if you're going down the ledge, they can see that bait, doing this. Whereas if it's coming back over the top of them behind them. But yeah, that's a 32nd ounce head with this. Again, if you're using mono, it still needs to, even if you're using a fixed bobber, shouldn't be more than 4 pounds, especially when you're using 32nd ounce, 16th ounce hooks. You're just, even with this, even if it's only 2.5 feet, that's still from this clip where it holds the line tight to your hook. That line in there will still try to use that memory. If it's not light enough line where this 32nd ounce jig head is enough to drop and hold tight that line, because that's what you want. That's what's going to indicate those very subtle bites. So that's how you want to maintain your depth. Your line itself is not maintaining your depth. It's just helping you get there. It's when fluoro's sinking, it's working against you. Mono, if you have the right size pound test, to keep contact with your bait, then it's helping you in the fact that it's not trying to work against you out ahead of the bait. Does it matter what color your mono is? No. Obviously, in crystal clear conditions, a clear, is going to be better. But they sell, the high vis green and things like that. There's lots and lots and lots of debate over, fishing line visibility to fish and whether or not that is, affects them. There's certain fish species where there's been enough research done on it, like smallmouth bass, things like that, where, a fluorocarbon line, which has about the same light refractive properties as water, is mostly invisible underwater, because as it's absorbing the light, it's absorbing at that same rate that the water is, where mono is absorbing the water. So there might be a little bit of a sheen or a shine on it. But even braided line, I mean, if you were just tied, if you had really light braided line on, 4 to 10 pound braid, and you tied your jig directly onto that, I mean, if you're in dingy water, they probably can't see it. But I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about, the color of your line or anything like that. Unless you're just in super crystal clear water, then, clear. And again, the diameter of the line helps. So if you're using monofilament, you're only using 2 or 4 pound test. That's basically invisible underwater. I mean, that line diameter is so small that no matter what color it is, they can't pick it up. But you start getting 6, 8, 10 pound test, that diameter gets bigger. It gives more opportunities for the light refraction to show the line. But 2, 4, 6 pound test, not really that big of a cause. See what else we got. Best Northeast OK rivers for crappie. They're all good, especially off of the main reservoirs. So going up the Neosho or going up the Spring out of Grand, fishing bank docks, and overhanging cover and structure that's on those, the verdigris, anything like that. Northeastern Oklahoma. I mean, really anywhere in the state. And even some in the Clearwater streams. I've picked up some really nice crappie in the Upper Illinois River during the summer fishing for smallmouth bass. So you never know where you're going to find fish. But, crappie, like most, species given the opportunity, they're going to follow flow and light longer the days, and they'll move up into those creeks, especially on big reservoirs. If there's inflowing water of any kind on major reservoirs, go up those to catch your crappie, because what they're doing is they're moving farther and farther away from all of those predatory species. Now, on smaller bodies of water where crappie are not quite as susceptible to predation, they, if there's some creek branches or things like that, you're probably going to get more spawning activity just, around the banks and the dam and the riprap. But on major reservoirs, any river that you're going to run up that's got inflow, and then any tributaries that you can, if there's creeks off of the main river, off of the lake, you're way up there on branches, yeah, you're going to pick up fish. But as far as what's the best, it's debatable. I mean, every angler in the Northeast would probably debate that one. But any of them are going to hold fish. So if all you got to be doing is looking for, heavy cover along the banks. Cause again, those major rivers and major tribs that go off of major reservoirs also invite major predators to follow up in there. So sticking closer to the banks and covering structure for crappie up creeks and rivers is going to be your best bet. The best approach to find crappies on a boat if you don't have a fish finder. So again, earlier in the presentation, we talked about what crappie are doing, what they're looking for. So when they're moving from that deep water into the shallow water, they're looking to follow hard ground. Quick transition areas are typically going to be rock ledges or things like that, hard substrate. So that's what those fish are using as their highway to get up, into an area. So if you don't have a fish finder, you want to go to areas where, crappie spawn, backs of creeks. And when I say creek, I mean the creek arm, not actually, if it has inflow, then you're going to go up the inflow. But if there isn't, if it's just, a dry creek bed that then is just a part of that branch of the lake or reservoir, the creek mouth is where I'd start at this time of year, that deeper water. So I'm going to use, again, if you don't have a fish finder, whatever body of water you're fishing on, especially if it's a bigger reservoir, you can go to Oklahoma Water Resources Board and click on Lake Atlas. It's right on their main page. You can click on that and it'll give you a list of most of the lakes in Oklahoma, most of the big ones. And you can download individual PDFs of those maps and print them off. And a lot of them have water. They have the actual contour lines. So use that. If you can find the map, whatever body of water you're going to with your boat, you don't have a depth finder. If it's a big body of water or a medium-sized impoundment, more than likely they're going to have a map on it. Now, not all of them have contour lines, but a lot of them do. So if you can find those contour lines, you're looking for those areas on the map where those lines are really close together. So the farther spread out those contour lines are, that means there's more water. That's a gradual transition from one depth to the other. When those lines are right next to each other, those are the quick transition. You're going from 5 feet to 10 feet to 15 feet to 20 feet in the span of maybe only 20 yards, 30 yards, big ledges. So that's where you would start for targeting crappie on a boat if you don't have a depth finder. And then looking for natural point, natural structure from that. So is there a primary point that comes out? Is there a secondary point? Those quick changes. Do I see any trees sticking up out of the water? Is there anything submerged that I can see? Because that's going to be cover, and you're just going to work your way, shallow from that to figure out where those fish are and they're spawning. Again, black crappie are going to move up first. They're done and finished out, and then the white crappie move in when those water temps go up a couple more degrees. So the period in which to catch the fish in those areas is typically 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. If the bigger the water, if you're on a small pond, your hot window for crappie fishing might be 10 days, max. It might be 4 days. Those fish come up, they're out. But man, those are the 4 best days of fishing in the year. You can't get out of them. But that's what you do if you didn't have a depth finder. Next one, what's your favorite 3 colors used on a regular basis for all year? My 3 favorite colors. I like, if I'm using baby shad, I like Bobby Garland's. Most brands make some form of a baby shad. They're just different types of plastic, different proprietary blends that they all say the tail works more, which like this right here, this is Bass Pro. I can feel the difference that this one's a little bit softer, so it doesn't take quite as much current to move that tail, whereas this one needs a little bit more action. That's really the only difference. But as far as coloration goes, love this. This is my favorite crappie color. For pre-spawn versus post-spawn. Post-spawn, this is still going to work, because this is why I like this all year round, because it is a bright color, but it also has those color variations that is in the natural prey base for that fish. So when they see this, they're identifying their natural prey base. When they see something, that's maybe like this, that might, they're not used to seeing this. They're like, we don't have any tropical pink fish in my farm pond. But post-spawn, those male fish are just looking for anything that could disrupt their fry. So these brighter colors are going to elicit more bites. But for year round, this, I also favor, a light blue. Again, if the chartreuse is maybe a little too much, if I'm in maybe really stained water, like clay colored water, I might use that, because those fish are going to lose their coloration. So they're going to maintain, a prey species will remain a dark back, but their underbelly is really going to lighten up if you can't get light penetration. So, these two here, and then it's kind of a pick 'em depending on what type of body of water I'm on. There's some lakes and ponds I fish, if I'm cast and retrieve, pre-molded little baby bluegill, as slow as I can go, is the hot ticket on a couple bodies of water that I fish. That outfishes everything else. And then on other bodies of water, I probably use something that a lot of crappie anglers don't use, which is a naturally colored, tube that typically people use for, bass or something like that. But this green pumpkin with red and black flake in it, these would be my primary go-tos year round wherever I went. Now there's going to be subtle differences wherever I go, and depending on time of year, I'm not going to use this one post-spawn. This one's not going to pick up as many reactionary bites just because it is so naturally colored. Same with this, unless I'm in crystal clear water, then I'll use these. But most of the bodies of water I fish are, clear is maybe 2 feet of visibility, 1 foot of visibility. So I'm looking at dingy water at best, and then stained and mud at worst. So that's where, something a little bit brighter. And then when you get into the post-spawn, colors that you hear a lot about, like electric chicken and things like that, those are great post-spawn. Chartreuse, obviously, chartreuse is tried and true in stained water, things like dingy water. But again, there's, no matter the fish species, predatory fish species that's looking to target, non-microorganisms that's big enough to inhale something. If you're in clay stained water, stick to reds, stick to whites, stick to, maybe a darkish back, or a light, like a reddish dark back to a light underbelly, or just straight white. When you get into the dingier water where it's kind of clear, but it's kind of not, so visibility maybe 2 to 4 feet, chartreuse, white, things that are still mimicking what's in there, but just a little bit that they can see. And then once I get into crystal clear water, then natural colorations all year round are going to fish as effectively, no matter if it's pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn. So those are kind of the 3 water types we get. Now, again, there's subtle differences in every body of water. But overall, those are my 3. Let's see, where are we else? Going to Broken Bow in the middle of March. Don't know the lake very well. Again, Broken Bow is a great crappie lake. Historically, lots and lots of brush piles. There's lots of guide boats on Broken Bow. So, if you see boats congregated in a certain area in March, they're either sitting on top of big bass or they're sitting over the top of crappie. But again, if you just utilize the principles of crappie, you want to move from, deep water that's very close to quick transitions. So that's going to be, points, creek mouths. But, Broken Bow is a pretty big reservoir, and it's got the main arms. But if I were to start somewhere, I'd go towards the upper mountain fork. So the north end of the lake, getting into those areas around points by, when did it say, the middle of March? Middle of March, you're probably in crappie spawn. Broken bow. Now this cold front, I don't know how long it's going to take, but 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, and it's probably going to jump back up. So once that water temp gets to 52 degrees, to 52 to 60, which is a pretty long period of time before that water really warms up. I mean, that's most of March, most of April, then into maybe early to mid-April in the southeast, you're going to start seeing those water temps kick up into the low to mid 60s, and then the black bass spawn starts. So go target the north end of the lake and get into the creek arms and things like that, where the main lake runs through. That's your main stem that comes in, but any branch that goes back into a cove or things like that, in the middle of March, you're probably going to be wanting to fish those transition areas. So if you're going to want to look for those quick depth changes, which are going to be around those points, secondary points, things like that, where they can move in between their deep cover and up. But by the middle of March, they've probably pushed up into the transition area and 12 to 6 feet of water in there, and they're going to be actively feeding. So just use the principles of avoid some of those main lake areas, start to push back into either up inflow tributaries or into the backs of creeks, and start at the mouth of the creek. And if you're on a boat and you can, mark fish, or you can, find the bottom structure or any type of cover, brush pile, anything that's down there, start there. And if you know what the depth is and you can control all that, and you're not getting bit, and you've tried a few different colors, move. If you're looking at the back, if I'm looking straight at the back of this creek arm or this cove, I'm going to look right, I'm going to look left, and I'm going to look at what points are coming out, what structure is different, what unique feature is different. And then I'm going to go to that, and then I'm going to work those depths all the way up into the shallows until I find the fish. And that's how I'm going to fish for crappie at any body of water that I'm not familiar with. I'm going to start at the mouths of creeks, and then I'm going to work my way up, quick transition changes, looking for those routes to get to their spawning beds. And then once you find them, especially at this time of year, the winter, they're kind of loose schooled, but when they start that pre-spawn, they're clumped up. So you find one fish, you're going to find many fish. So that's how I'd go about that. Any more questions? Where is the best place to fish in like Hefner in late winter? If we're talking for crappie, out the marinas, any of those inlets right off of those points, any cover that's out there, there's some boulders and stuff. Most of Hefner is all riprap. The entire east side, north side, and west side, or northwest side, is pretty much riprap. So you're going to have crappies scattered out through that, but there's lots of predators in Hefner, open water predators, walleye, saugeye, and hybrid striped bass, white bass, will target juveniles and things like that. So crappie are on the food menu at Hefner. So looking for areas that, like those marinas and where those fishing jetties come off, where crappie at this time, because right now Hefner's at like 35 degrees. They went from like 45 to 35 pre last week, and then today now it's starting to try to climb up. So the fish are probably going to be pretty inactive. They just got shocked. They're kind of in that winter lull, but the light cycle is warming. So I'd give that body of water, maybe even this weekend we'll get some sunlight. It's going to rapidly heat because it rapidly cooled, and we didn't sustain that for months. It was just a quick week of Arctic air, which froze everything, but now that's thawing out. It's going to warm back up pretty quickly. Days are getting longer. But that's where you want to look on Hefner. Now, once you get into the spawn there, then it's just shallow water. But the areas that had the most kind of shelter from predators, which is around those marinas for the most part, in the deeper areas where they can hang around stuff, those transition areas are going to be the best to target on Hefner. From now until probably third week of March, fourth week of March, that water temps might be suitable for them, at least the black crappie spawning. And then you're just going to want to target water that's 1 to 8 foot deep around any riprap. Anywhere where there's that hard bottom, that's what those fish are looking to spawn on. Um, so the next question I see is Watauga Lake being drained. There's been dam reconstruction and maintenance ongoing, so the water levels have fluctuated on Watauga. How does that affect fish? Rapid rises or falls, during the spawn, that's not good. Some fish like the rain to come in, they like the flooding, but that's because they're pushing up inflow. Fish that spawn, on the main body of the lake, so any creek arms that go up but don't actually have inflowing water outside of excessive runoff, elevation changes, rapid ones, when the water temps and the time of year is right for spawning, can have adverse effects. Your fish are still going to attempt to spawn. So if there's suitable habitat, now maybe the drop, it's not as gradual. So, if the water's dropping, you just want to target fish, a few more feet out, but it's going to be quicker depths. But rapid water changes during the spawning period for any species is detrimental to because they understand that when water rises, anglers have the tendency to want to fish super shallow. Like that water's come up, so those fish are moving up the structure. If you have high water during the spawning period, and you're like, okay, it's 1 foot of water, those fish sense what we can't. They know that water is only there temporarily. So where maybe the year before on a normal water condition, you were catching fish in 2 feet of water right up near the bank. Well, now that water level's up here, this was your 2 foot of water, but now it's 6 foot of water. They're still going to utilize that because they know where that water left, it's going to come back to that. So think about it the same way of water dropping back down. Fish can kind of anticipate the weather patterns that are coming through, but they don't know that, we're going to get 10 inches of rain, water's going to fill up, I need to wait. So, just continue to target fish in the water column where they'd be at. So if the water is really low, then you're obviously fishing out a little bit deeper. And one thing that I will say about low water on any body of water, anytime you get an opportunity to fish a body of water, especially one that you're semi-familiar with, when you can fish them on low water, it tells you so much about that body of water that you might not have been able to see. You can maybe see it on your depth finder. You might see it on a contour line on a map, but visually being able to see what's in the water when we get massive drawdowns, it might adversely affect fishing this year where you're not catching as many fish. But when that water returns to normal, you now know actual, physical parts of the bottom of that lake that if you're paying attention, that can really change, that can separate you from other anglers on that body of water. So anytime you get an opportunity to fish water on low water, understand the fishing is probably going to be less consistent and less active, but the lessons that you learn from them are, invaluable for future fishing seasons. So never don't go fishing because of water level. They teach you things, but when the water is above normal during spawning periods, target deeper. If you're fishing from the bank or from your boat, don't target where the water line is. Target where you knew fish were the year before. Look for those areas because they know there's going to be a drop. And then if you're low water, look for take photos, flip your phone out, take pictures. So the next time you get out there the next year, you're like, oh man, yeah, that little bluff that's right there, I had no idea. There's this huge line that runs right down it. And now you know that those fish are sitting. You had no idea. If the water was at full and you have this big, ledge that comes in, it just doesn't look like anything. But in reality, maybe there's a gravel bar that runs along that. Those are just things that hold fish that you get to see when you're when the water's low. So, but as far as Watauga goes, the water it's not shut down or anything like that, but they are doing maintenance on that dam and have been doing it now for a few years. Any tips for fishing the Mayfly hatch for crappie? As far as maybe you could better clarify that, Mayfly hatch as in targeting fish on top water with mayflies, to bring up rises. Crappie, again, you're probably not going to get, while they are going to come up, that surface feeding activity, you're probably going to hit into more bluegill and bass that might come up for something like that. But for fish, I mean, obviously mimicking those colors and things and utilizing, if you're going to fish like a mayfly nymph, if you're fly fishing, then, you know, stick to the small sizes. One way, if you're fishing on still water with a fly rod, put a float on. You know, usually if you're nymph fishing, you're thinking that, oh, the bobber is moving with current, but you can, you know, kind of move that, strip your float in with the fly rod with, you know, any type of natural type patterns. Those are going to work just like, you know, any of these are. But if you are fly fishing, you know, again, once you get into the post spawn, you know, maybe strip a little tiny bright streamer through, you know, a really, really obnoxious, you know, nymph or something like that, and just kind of move the bob around to attract those male fish. I don't know if that answers the question. No, I'm not quite sure what the question entirely was. So if that wasn't good enough, follow up. Does the department stock any lakes? Yeah, we stock most lakes. Crappie's not a species that we stock, but we stock many species throughout the state. Primarily saugeye, hybrid striped bass, hybrid sunfish. Those are our three big ones. And then down south, our Durant hatchery, we have a largemouth bass program for the Florida strain of largemouth bass. So, and then we occasionally will stock different species that we have, you know, if we have some channel cats or things like that, but we don't stock crappie. Your favorite spots for crappie at Oologah, Keystone, and Skiatook. All three Great Lakes for crappie fishing. Favorite spots, I mean, those bigger bodies of water, bridge pylons, especially anything that goes into like backwater around those types of areas as those fish push up. But those are loaded lakes. So, you know, you're going to do a lot of running and gunning on those lakes where you pick up, you know, 5 fish here, 5 fish there, 10 fish here, and just constantly moving. So I don't have like a spot on either of those lakes where it's like, go here. But if there is, you know, any type of riprap. So, you know, most people associate the riprap with dam areas, but, you know, marinas, bridge pylons, even little, you know, if there's offshoot arms that go up, a lot of overlooked areas for boat anglers especially is, you know, getting in the backs of some of those creeks. You know, maybe a state highway goes over, or a little residential road where there's just, you know, doesn't look like much, but that structure, that ditch that has to run through there, that funnel, and then having some riprap, those are great areas to target crappie that maybe people aren't targeting because they're focused on brush piles, or they're, you know, out towards the mouths of those creek arms. So those are unique areas on bodies of water that are that big, that are as productive as they are. You know, look for structure and covered areas that might be off the beaten path, especially if riprap is involved, because again, crappie need that hard substrate to spawn. And if they don't have it, which typically only occurs in like a pond or a small impoundment where they really don't have a true hard substrate to work with, then they're going to look to spawn on the top of a rock or on the top of a log to put those eggs down. Because if they fall into sediment, they suffocate. So the milk, when it goes down, those fish, the eggs can't remain oxygenated. So hard structure. Let's see where we at on the questions. What is the best bait for panfish and bass? Best bait, subjective. Every angler is different. But natural. If you're not using bait, if you're not using live or dead natural bait, so minnows, worms, anything like that, if it is artificial, mimicking as close to the natural prey species for the species you're targeting is going to yield the most consistency as far as finding fish, hooking up on fish, and landing fish. But there's always, you know, post-spawn crappie throwing bright, you know, obnoxious colors that you probably wouldn't typically use for, you know, something like that. Those will catch bass. Those will catch panfish, reactionary strikes. But sticking to natural colorations of the prey species and understanding what those prey species are. In a river or a creek, it might be crustaceans. They might be looking for that type of forage base where they don't have an active bait fish population for them to eat. So it's just understanding what type of water you're in, and what those prey species are, and best mimicking them. But again, for really any type of fishing, you can't fish slow enough. A lot of people are afraid to go too small because obviously big bait, big fish. But that is only true because a small fish can't eat that big bait. But there's nothing stopping a big fish from eating small bait. So the smaller, the more natural the coloration to the prey base in a given body of water for the species you're targeting is going to catch more fish. It's going to catch a multitude of species because it gives better opportunity to catch, you're not eliminating other fish from inhaling what you're offering. So small bait fish colorations, 1/8 of an ounce down to a 32nd of an ounce. You're going to catch the most fish doing that. You might not necessarily catch the biggest fish, but you're going to catch the most fish with still the opportunity to hook into big fish. Okay, think that got us through the questions. We've got about a half an hour left. See if there's anything else that I missed in kind of my loose agenda here. Sometimes if the bite dies down post spawn, and maybe pair something natural with your bait or with your artificial, so like a live minnow. Crappie Nibbles, probably seen these at any of your sporting goods stores. They come in lots of different colors and sizes. I like the power bait chrome glows. They give off a little bit of glow underneath the water. That's another thing, jig heads that you use. See if I have any in this one. Yeah, so here's the difference between two same size jig heads. So these are both 16th ounce jig heads. This one right here is a glow head. So it's got glow paint on it. So in dingier water, it's not going to be like a flashlight underwater, but it is putting off a little bit of that, light energy that will draw on fish in stained water. So like a crappie nibble and a glow head, if you are using a jig head, that's what I recommend in dirtier water. It's going to help, just kind of attract those fish because they're relying on all their senses to get there. Well, if sight isn't one of them, because it's clear, then you need a little bit extra to get their attention when it might only be that far in front of them. And if you had a regular glow head, that bait or lure might move past them, but this might be giving off just enough to stimulate their senses that they're going to come over and check it out. So I use glow heads in clear water too, but that's just a little subtle thing. To help crappie nibbles, glow heads, any little thing to add to a naturally colored bait just to kind of enhance its attractiveness to that fish is always a good idea. So, and I'll typically start off pre-spawn crappie fishing, with, if I'm using artificial, especially like a baby shad or a tube, I might throw, one of these on, every cast, every time I'm hooking up a fish. And if I've hit, 4 or 5, 6, if I'm hitting fish cast after cast after cast, then I'll take the crappie nibble off. And if I can catch them just straight on artificial, I won't waste any more crappie nibbles. But sometimes, especially on ponds and smaller bodies of water, something as subtle as just one crappie nibble or using a glow head jig, you're not doing anything to alter your presentation or anything like that other than just a subtle enhancement of your lure. So little things like that can sometimes go a long ways. Let's see. One thing we didn't really cover, I haven't seen anybody bring it up, but if you watch a lot of crappie fishing shows or, content like that, you see people with the big spider rigs off of their boat, running multiple rods. I'm not a huge multiple rod user on a boat, especially during spawning periods, unless I have enough hands on deck to be able to grab those rods. That can be a nightmare. Sometimes you overextend yourself during the spawn. You get too many rods going at once. Equipment gets broken, things like that. But if you are going to run spider rods and there's only, or a spider rig with your rods, like 4 to 6 rods, probably max, especially in areas where fish might not be spawning. They might have might not have good enough spawning habitat for like hard substrate. So they're spawning maybe in deeper water over like a big rock, like a flat rock that's out there, or a big lay down log. And you want to, you know, fit. There's a lot of fish, obviously, that have congregated there because it's like the spawning opportunity is limited. We don't have a lot of great spawning habitat. That's where a spider rig can come in handy when you're out on the boat. So you can run your different depths down that log or down whatever that, you know, hard structure is to pick up more fish. But again, I recommend having multiple hands on deck. If you're trying to run 4 or 6 rods at a time and the fishing is hot and heavy, you know, there's a good chance that 4 of those 6 rods might all go over at once. And I don't like breaking equipment and things like that. So, but all dealer's choice, all anglers' preference. But vertical presentations for crappie, you know, spider rig just offered you the opportunity to offer 4 to 6 different baits, you know, at different depths at the same exact time in a fairly, you know, close area. A lot of people will run spider rigs off the back and troll little crankbaits, you know, at different depths through the water column, you know, a little slow troll to pick up bigger crappie in open water, especially during the summer months as those fish retreat back out. So let's see, what in Gulpilai? Well, they don't sell pre-rigged. You know, there's a lot of salt, things like that, just chemical properties that will corrode, especially real thin wire hooks, you know, bigger or thicker hooks, you know, different brands like Owner Hook, the brand Owner, they make more thick wired hooks, even in the really small sizes. Whereas, you know, like a Gamakatsu or an Eagle Claw, you know, the same size hook is a much finer, you know, thinner wire that they use on it. Those ones are going to be more susceptible to corrosion before, you know, a thicker stainless steel type deal. But that's all. I mean, just like salt properties and fluid, you know, if you put that into a closed space and it's not getting air to dry out, and then it sits in there and then it dries out in your tackle box, then that's why all that stuff falls apart. It's just chemical corrosion. Let's see, you know, again, we kind of talked about, you know, those fish getting there. Again, bodies of water. So the spawn in most parts of the state starts in the southeast and kind of fans its way up across to the northwest, sweeping in kind of both directions. So, you know, your spawn down along the Red River and then kind of up the Arkansas border, that's typically where water is going to warm up the quickest. So you're going to see that kind of move up. And then, you know, central Oklahoma, northeastern Oklahoma, north central Oklahoma, those are all going to kind of hit around the same times. And then it's going to shift up into the northwest part of the state to stabilize those. Now, if you're fishing small bodies of water, you know, there's like little different subtle changes even in the same regional area, because the smaller a body of water is, you know, the faster it's going to heat up. So, you know, in some instances, probably by next week, if there's any ponds in the southern part of the state that are going to get to, you know, 52 degrees or something like that, you'd have black crappies spawning next week. But most of our main reservoirs, even in the southeastern part of the state, are trying to recover from this thawing out process. So surface temperatures are, you know, in most cases in the 30s. And prior to the event, most water temps were in the low to mid 40s, which is still, you know, several degrees away from really active fish in the shallower water, moving out away from those deep wintering areas where you have to be a lot more patient to catch those fish, because you might dangle it above them for a long time in 20 foot of water. And then, you know, that fish just finally decides it comes up and it grabs it. But as we get into the pre-spawn and the spawn, those fish are looking fast and furious on things like that. So target your ponds and small bodies of water in your region first, and then understand that the crappie spawn on your bigger reservoirs is going to be lagging a couple weeks behind. Sometimes it's not that much, sometimes it's drastic, and it changes year over year. Just sometimes a watershed picks up more water. You could have 2 lakes right next to each other and they're coming from different tributaries, and a rain system moved through. It's pushing inflow. They're right next to each other. Water temperatures are similar, but all of a sudden fish are looking to spawn on this body of water moving up creek. So just always pay attention to little subtle differences in your region, but small water to big water starting basically now. In the next week or so, we will see this pre-spawn movement really start to take hold across, a good portion of the state. And then by the second week of March, you're pretty much into pre-spawn, all the way from northeast Oklahoma to southwest Oklahoma. And then in, some instances up towards the Panhandle in the northwest, they might be a week away. But we're right there. We're right on the doorstep of pulling those fish out of that deeper cover. And again, like I said earlier in the presentation, with this Arctic blast, our threadfin population is taking a serious hit. We've gotten reports from all over the state, dead fish, little dead shad floating everywhere because they're subtropical fish. They don't like water temperatures under 50 degrees. Now, can they handle 45 degrees pushing out into deeper water? Absolutely. And that's what keeps their species alive in the state. But we don't really know how that's going to affect fishing. My personal opinion is that fishing is going to be awesome this year. I think you lose some of that prey base. That creates competition, for food sources where, a lot of small forage fish, very susceptible. The shad, the threadfin died off because of water temperature, but a lot of other small, last year's year class. So, the young of the year, your fry and things like that, your little fingerlings of any species that are prey based, small crappies, small bluegill, any other type of sunfish, all of your other types of, shiners and minnows that live in a body of water, they had to move out into deeper water. As those, in some cases, in the backs of their little shelters in those creeks and coves where they live, it froze solid down to the bottom, 6, 7, 8 inches in the vegetation that they inhabit. So those fish are built to live in climates that they can handle the water change, but it forced them out into places in the water where they more than likely got predated on. So we're probably going to see a trickle down effect of forage base that got eaten because the threadfin were dying off. Now, a lot of fish are probably gorging themselves. If anybody's driven by a body of water lately, especially, a river or a lake, you're seeing birds all over the place. They're just picking off all of those shad that have died. And right underneath the surface, you've got blue cats and any of our temperate bass species coming up and, sucking all that down. But the fish that we're looking for, our crappie, our bass, our panfish, as we move into March, April, and May, I personally think that there's going to be a more active bite this year. Now, it's just going to come down to the pattern. Are fish going to target something that is more of a thread fin pattern? We have a little crankbait right here that's pretty close. So that's a pretty close representation of a thread fin coloration. So something like this is, our fish going to realize, man, I'm not seeing a lot of these anymore, but it's a favorite meal of mine. So they key in on it. Or did we lose so many in a body of water that now the forage base, the predator fish have focused their efforts on, back to gizzard shad and bluegill and maybe even, other small forage fish that they might not have typically targeted, they would eat if given the opportunity, but didn't specifically go after. We're going to see all of that play out, which is going to be really fun here in the next month to 6 weeks. It's always fun to figure out something like that in fishing. And it's going to vary from lake to lake. But personally, I think this is going to be an awesome year for fishing. We've had a very gradual climb out of the winter up until last week. But again, fortunately, it happened early enough that we weren't, getting into, blooming conditions, covered conditions around the banks and things like that, getting foliage, providing more cover. It happened early enough that we were still in winter. So outside of just being detrimental to our threadfin population and then any of the effects that were caused because of that down the chain of command, down to our microorganisms and things like that, I think it's just going to create competition. It might have an adverse effect in some ways on reproduction, as normal, healthy fish, might starve to death. But that's going to create competition, and in the future, that's going to lead to survival of the fittest. Our stronger fish species were able to maintain it, so we come out of it. We've seen that with deer hunting over the last few years in the state. We went through the big drought. We lost a lot of animals, but the ones that survived were able to survive. And now in the last few years, I mean, we're seeing deer that have been killed in the state that we haven't seen before. I mean, these antler sizes are ridiculous on some of these deer. We will see some of those similar effects on fish. Because of the event that we just had and losing a primary forage species pretty much across the board, across the state, it's going to have trickle-down effects. But I think those are positive effects, moving forward. You might see some short-term negative, but long-term, I think it's good. And for this year's fishing season, I think it's going to be very good because it's going to create that competition for bite. It's going to probably be more helpful for artificial anglers versus live, because now fish can't be quite as picky if there isn't that type of prey base for them to go after. You might also catch some more unique species on targeting in ways that you didn't think. You might pick up channel cats, blue cats on lures that you wouldn't typically associate with catching those fish on. I think we're going to see more people have surprise catches this year because of what just happened with some of the forage bases. Any more? Our tilapia problem in Oklahoma? No, not currently. I don't know of any areas that outside of private ponds that people choose to stock in. They're not really a problem in public water. They are fun to catch, but tilapia are a subtropical fish, maybe even a tropical fish. You could be described as where they live in fresh water down into South America, Central America. So our water temps, like threadfin, if they had the dip, I mean, I bet you some tilapia took quite a hurting in Texas because of these water temps. I bet a lot of them weren't able to survive that. So, but no, we don't have any problems with that. Can crappie be caught in any of the close to home lakes? Yes. A lot of the older bodies of water, a lot of our close to home waters were farm ponds or things like that back in the day. So they're going to hold an abundance of different types of fish. The very small bodies of water are getting stocked with channel catfish and hybrid sunfish. They're going to have largemouth bass in them, but your crappie populations are probably going to be limited. Now on lakes like Kitchen Lake, Crystal Lake, Kids Lake over by Lake Hefner, those all have crappie in them. They're all decent small body of water crappie fisheries. We don't stock them with crappie. Anything that has inflow or outflow where fish can potentially move around because of flooding, you're going to see crappie in those bodies of water. Both black and white crappie are native to Oklahoma. They inhabited all of our creeks and rivers prior to dams being built across the state. So you're going to find crappie in most bodies of water, but the smallest of the close to home bodies of water, probably not. Because if they're that small, the crappie will overrun it. So then it'll just be all crappie, but that's not really the case in our close to home. So if you're in Oklahoma City, that's where I'd look. Any other close to home areas around, just look for some of the bigger ones in comparison, 15 acres, 5 acres. But if you have a little half-acre pond, it probably doesn't have a sizable enough population of crappie to really get into them. If stable weather, how many days do they stay on the banks? Well, they're staying on the banks to spawn. So when they get to the bank, those female fish go from, deep water winter, occasional slow eaten meal, to moving to those quick depth changes for that pre-spawn sitting where they can be looking upward. So if there's any brush or things that are around some of those drop-offs, even better, where they can come up and ambush. But the second that they've pushed up, and again, crappie depth range for spawning is going to be between 1 and 8 feet. But in some places, it's going to be 1 feet. In some places, it's going to be closer to 8 feet. But those females, when they're ready, when they drop their eggs, it's egg dropping on. And they're not looking to feed right away. They're going to go recover, and they're going to move back out to those transition areas, maybe even back out to those wintering areas where they can just kind of relax for a few days. hang out in that oxygenated water and then move back into the transition areas to feed again. But those male fish that are staying on the banks, they're staying on the banks with the fry. So typically, how long is that going to last? It's going to vary fish by fish, but I mean, you're looking at 1 to 3 weeks in some areas of them staying up there. But again, once they have spawned and they are on the bank, they're not looking to feed. So those bites are reactionary, becomes harder to set the hook. It's an awesome time to fish, but it's just a little bit, different. Brighter colors, slower presentation, keeping constant contact with that lure, because again, it's not going to be that slow rise bite to eat it. It's going to be a quick thump because it's going to grab, that's why the smaller the better. Post spawn, you really want to size down the offering where the hook point is near the end, because that crappie's coming in trying to bite it. It's not trying to inhale it. It's just trying to get it to either kill it, injure it, but get it away from its fry. So you get into the post spawn when those fish are on the banks, as you say. During that time period, make sure you have contact with your bait, and you've downsized your hook offering to be near the rear of whatever you're throwing. Because the farther up it is, which works great, for drop shot, or if you're just, using some type of vertical presentation where instead of having a weighted hook, you're using, something like an octopus hook or a double wide drop shot hook, fishing vertically below either an egg weight on a swivel or a piece of split shot or whatever you're doing to get, your 2 pound, 4 pound, 6 pound test down to where you have contact with your rod tip. Putting something like this on and letting it sit down there where it's like that. Well, look where that hook point is. That hook point's all the way in the front of the front. So that's a feeding presentation. That's a pre-spawn presentation. But a post-spawn presentation, that 32nd ounce hook, that's near the rear. I'd still, even if you could get it a little bit farther back where, maybe cut off, you can take your bait. And if you feel like you're getting bit over and over and over again, you're like, oh, it's just small fish pecking. It's not. It's probably, in some cases it's big fish, but it's not a peck. It's a predatory get away from my children type bite. So if you want to get that hook point back, take scissors or nippers or whatever, and just cut off 1/2 inch off that. So that's all you're offering. And now put that jig head back on. And when you run it through, now don't go into the tail on these. So like right at the back or at the base, right here where that wiggle starts. I want to get that hook point right there, but not onto the tail, because I still want that tail action. But now when I put that on, now look where my hook point's at. Now my hook point's right on the back of the tail. So now if something comes up and gets it, I got a much better chance to stick that fish. But those peck, bounce bites, it's not, oh, it must be the small crappie moving up. They can't get, no, it's those same fish, but that they're not looking to feed. So it's a different type of bite. But stable weather to get them to the point where they spawn, start looking at those overnight lows. As water temperatures increase, and you see that, whether you're going to USGS, if you type in most bodies of water and type water temperature, you can get measurements from the dam or from the spillway. But as those water temperatures start to climb and you're like, all right, we hit 50 degrees, we're getting close, we're gonna start to see some fish suck up to those transition areas. I can hit them now from the bank. Look at those overnight lows. If they're like 55 for a few days, it's like, all right, it's time to go. Because that's going to keep the stabilization of those water temps. And then as the days get longer, that's what triggers that fish. Moon phase with crappie, I don't know how much of a role it plays. I mean, all the different factors are going to contribute. But when they're spawning, I mean, they're going to act the same when they're spawning. Like when they get into that mode, they have one job to do. And oftentimes weather is not going to affect that. If fish have made the decision that we've had consistent temperatures and you get a cold front that comes through, don't think because now all of a sudden the daytime high is 42 and the overnight low is 21, but the water temps have got to 54 degrees and they've been stable like that for a few days and climbing. Some of those cold days where everybody else leaves the water, like, oh man, all those fish are going to run back out, retreat. They're not. Once they get into that mode, they have one job to do, and that is their primary purpose. So it would take some type of significant weather event to disrupt that deal. So don't let cold fronts affect you once you've had that stabilization of water temperatures and air temps when we get into that range, which is starting right now. We've come out of this. Today's 70 degrees. So this is going to help warm those water temperatures up, and people are going to start seeing an increase in fish bite. But as those crappie move up, again, you just want that consistent, stable trend upward. But once you get to that point, do not let a cold front throw you off the water. A lot of times, those are the days you get the lake to yourself, and fishing is just as good because those fish cannot be disrupted from what their job is, which is ultimately to end up spawning. And when they get that far into the process, they're not going to break away from that because of one cold day, one north wind. But people, sun phase, moon phase, all of those, play some type of a part. But moon phase during the spawning period of crappie, it's probably not going to increase or decrease bites. That's going to be more once you get out of those spawning areas. So that would be, pay attention, read forums, there's lots of good online resources today that didn't exist 15, 20 years ago when all you maybe had was a chat room. There are reputable sources beyond the Department of Wildlife in Fisherman, Field and Stream, Wired to Fish, things like that, where, you can look at, you can read content on moon phase or little subtle things like that until your eyes get sore. But there's lots of good information out there, and it's going to vary angler to angler. Have seen a bunch of buffalo get caught fishing for crappie. Yeah, buffalo drum. Again, I mean, these little imitator baits will pick up just about anything, but drum like to hang up in there. And I've, especially fishing riprap on dam, I've caught lots and lots of drum using small swim bait type imitators. So if you do see kind of, rough fish or non-game fish being caught in the same areas as crappie during that crappie spawn, it's just, fish and sharing similar habitat looking for a prey base, but you will see that. If you have time, please show us the drop shot rig again. Okay. Where's my drop shot rig go? So here's our drop shot right here. All right. So we got a hook tied to our main line. Then we have our weight. So I'll go through how to set that up. There's different styles of weights that you can use. I like these, tungsten steel, less overall volume. It's a much more condensed weight than lead. So that's a 1/8 ounce, and a 1/8 lead ounce would be probably about that long before you got to it. Just, it's more of a condensed weight. So I like these. Right here, you can see that there's an eye hole to stick your line through, but at the top, there's no gap. It's not meant to have like a traditional fishing knot tied through. So I'll unclip this and show, we'll just go start to finish with the main line, how to set up a drop shot. And again, you have to know your crappie really well for drop shotting for them to be super effective. I like to use it on ponds just as when I'm doing cast and retrieve techniques, I'll utilize a drop shot like I would if I was straight cast and retrieving. I know at all times what my depth is. It's the only reason I do it. I know what the depth is. If I'm straight cast and retrieving, in my head, I know that I'm probably within a foot or so of where I want to be in that strike zone, but I can't control that perfectly. When I know I'm touching the bottom, I know how far I can keep that bait off. So I use the drop shot setup for something, small bodies of water where I know the crappie are at. Just because it's fun to me. It's a fun bite for them to come in. It's just a different way to catch fish. But I'll show you how to set this up. Drop shots are super simple to set up. They look They look difficult just because most people don't tie a hook onto the line and have the line continue. You know, if you see line attachments, it's not, it's usually with a swivel or secondary line. So you start by tying on your hook. So from your main line. Now, again, I'm going to use fluorocarbon, you know, because I have contact with my weight because this is heavy enough. Well, my offering is small. It weighs almost next to nothing. You know, this is a non-weighted hook, you know, no weight system on the shank, no jig head, no nothing. And then this, and I have, you know, either a shad or some, you know, a tube, any type of small something that you put on a drop shot hook. So here we go. Line. All right. So if this was the main line for my rod, and again, when I was talking about this is monofilament line, but for the presentation, again, doesn't make that much of a difference, but because you have contact. But I can use fluorocarbon where I said the line is sinking because I'm not trying to keep it suspended while I'm moving it. I have contact. I have a point of contact with the bottom with my weight. So at all times, I am keeping that tension. So it keeps my line tight to my rod tip so I don't get that bow. But when I'm trying to slow retrieve and I'm using fluorocarbon, it's going to start to bow towards the line, which is working against me. So what you do is to attach your hook, we're going to use a Palomar knot. So you can do it two ways. With this is a really small, this is a size 6, number 6 drop shot hook. I use drop shot hooks all the way up to, you know, 1/0. Some people, if you're bass fishing, all the way up to 2/0. But for crappie fishing, number 2 to number 6 work great. You know, it's just a small hook. More offering for fish. You're going to catch more fish. Smaller the hook. So one thing that's really important when setting up your drop shot, right? So here's your hook. Here's the front of the eye. There's the back of the eye. Make sure when you tie the knot, when you go through with your line, you are going through the front. So where the hook, go through the hook point side always. That's where you should be tying on your hooks. Almost all the time, there are some bait holding hooks like for worms and night crawlers that crook the other way. And then there's hooks that don't kind of have that kink at the eye hole. It's just straight up. And for those, you want to go through the point side. There are certain hooks that bend over the other way where you go through the back, but that's for a vertical presentation, not for, this is more of a horizontal presentation. And we want it to stand up on the line. So there's two ways you can do the Palomar with an eye hole that small. This is 6-pound test. I know I can double my line and do it through. And this is just kind of a quick way to get through, or you can use a Palomar knot. If the eye hole is too small or you don't feel, sometimes you can't get it bent perfectly to get it through there. So you just run the line straight through the point side eye hole. We're going to want, you know, I want a good bit. I'm going to pull it through 2 feet just so I have enough slack. Then I'm going to run it back through the back side. So I brought the line through. We're going to go back the way we came from to create that loop. If you can't just double over the line and get it through that way on the first attempt. Like you would like a big bass hook or something like that. So now we're going to pull our tag end back through because the tag end is not getting clipped like you would if you're tying a hook on. This is going to our weight. So we want as much of that as possible because you can always go shorter. You can't make that line any longer once you get down there. So you bring it through, you have your nice little loop on your line, right? So a simple overhand knot where you pull it through. So now we have a loop with both ends of the line like this, right? All we're going to do is we're going to run the loop that we had and we run it over. Let's see. Everybody can see it. Have our knot. Get that. And we're going to run the hook through that loop. Then wet your line. Pull that tight. Now, most important part. So we've got our hook on our line, right? But we need, now my tag end is going up off the hook. I need to go underneath the hook. Take your tag end of your line and you're going to run it back through the point side of the eye hole. So we're going to go back through that. Make sure your knot's on there real good. You don't have a lot of, again, this is a 6 pound test. I would typically be using 2 or 4. So just make sure that when you tie that Palomar, that excess line has cinched tight, or the the hook's not going to sit right when we run this tag end back through. So we take our tag end, take the end of that, we're going to run it right back through that eye hole. And then pull all the excess line, all that tag end line, pull it right through, right? So now what it's done is when I pull that tight and it sits on there, it works that knot to where it should sit up on there. But again, this 6 pound test didn't get a great first knot on there. But what it does is it pulls where that knot sits when you run the line back through. That knot kind of pulls back to the underside, which forces these hooks to sit kind of upright. Now, because this one is a double wide, now I'll show you. This is this is a Mustad octopus hook, size 6. Let me find another drop shot hook where you can run into problems, and I'll show you here. So we're on the line, right? And you can see that once that knot gets cinched, the way it's sitting, where the line runs through, we kind of have a crook right here. So it sits. So it's actually facing a little bit downwards, but our bait's going to be right here on the corner when we put the bait on, whatever I'm running. So I run it through the bottom, and then I come out the nose. I don't go up through the top of the head. You're not going to get as much action that way. It's not going to look as natural. So I bring it right through the nose of the bait, but it hangs out right here. But having that gap there, so if you can see where the hook point is versus where the eye hole is, that's a finger to get in there, right? That's a good gap. That's what you want. That fish comes and grabs it, and you're pulling upward, and that hook point is faced straight into the top of its mouth. There are lots of hooks on the market, and lots of hooks that are sold as drop shot hooks. And I'll show you the difference. This is a Gamakatsu drop shot hook. It's advertised as being a drop shot hook. See where the eye hole is and the hook point? They're almost in line with each other. So what does that mean if that fish just barely grabs onto it and opens its mouth? Well, your line now is being pulled in this almost the same direction as the hook point. So that goes in your mouth, it shoots straight back out. You will get bit just as often on this hook. You will hook up, a quarter, depending on how quick you are, anywhere from 25 to 75% less than you're going to hook up on, a double wide hook or something like that, where the hook point is facing almost parallel with where the eye hole is. That gives you that way when you're pulling it out, that hook point's up. The line's coming out this way, but the hook is actually going upwards. Whereas this one, that hook point is going straight back out towards the water. So that's just something. Doesn't mean these won't catch fish, and it certainly doesn't mean you won't get bit. You will get bit just as often. You will just have a harder success rate of hookup and landing when that's your gap, when that hook point's facing back. So just something to pay attention. And you can figure that out, like when you're looking at a hook package, just turn it to look where the eye hole is, and then look at the hook point, and then turn in the packaging to see one of the hooks and just look where the eye hole is. And if it looks like the point is coming back to the eye hole, that's not a substantial gap, even though it's being advertised as a drop shot hook. So mosquito hooks, things that aren't advertised as being a drop shot hook, are actually more effective for drop shotting, at least when it comes to your hookup rate and then landing the fish. Not anything about presentation, or none of that changes. It's just simply the hookup and land rate. So now the last portion is we have to hook up our weight, right? Now, if I'm fishing out on a reservoir, if I'm really familiar with the bottom structure, anything like that, if I'm out on a boat, these tungsten long weights, really hard to get snagged up on. They can move through rocks and vegetation and everything else. Still doesn't mean they can't get wedged in something. And these are not cheap. They make lead ones that you can get for the same, you get 4 of these in a pack for the same price that you'd get 15 or 20 lead ones in a pack. So that might, keeping a box of those around for like pond fishing and things like that, you're going to run your line through. And so I want to be at about 12 inches because I want my bait once they get up into that really shallow water, I only want to be about, 8 inches off the bottom, 8 to 6 moving around, because those fish are sitting right there, basically on the bottom, getting ready to spawn in those transition zones. If you're going to have to tailor it, again, I don't do a lot of this out on big water. I primarily drop shot on, very small bodies of water. But again, so we said there's no eye hole, right? Or there's an eye hole, but it doesn't really look like there's a place to tie knot. So once I've figured out on my line, I want to get about 12 inches. So I'm about right there. Grab both ends of the line like this, and then just pull the weight. That line cinches up in there. Now I tie an overhand knot so that will hold it, but it's not fail safe. And I don't want to lose an expensive weight. So just one overhand knot. Now this way, I'm not going to have much problems with this. As far as catching crappie, as far as getting hung up. I don't recommend drop shotting too close to heavy cover, especially like brush or trees that have fallen in with a lot of limbs. Because what ends up happening is you're drop shotting right on the edge of that. You're safe. You're not hung up on anything. Crappie grabs it, gets into that. Well, you got control of the crappie, but now you got 12 inches of line back behind you with this weight that's just swinging around. It gets wrapped up. You lose expensive weights. So if you're not fishing up gradual, like hard structure, deep to shallow and working up, or vice versa, if you're fishing from the boat using the same technique, then what I recommend, don't use your expensive weights. Don't even use the, lead ones. Because if you're fishing close to that heavy a cover, more than likely you're either dead sticking or giving kind of a vertical presentation. Whereas if you're bank fishing up that hard structure from the transition zone back to the spawning beds, you're just kind of running over flat stuff. So if where is my split shot at? I will use a piece of split shot for my weight. I don't have any real big split shot here, but again, this was 1/8 of an ounce. So if I'm using a vertical presentation, an 1/8 of an ounce, and then just crimp on a piece of split shot down here and use that as your weight instead of one of those expensive weights. And that way, if that fish runs back into that brush, you're going to lose the split shot, but you're not going to break your line. And then you can just put another piece of split shot on. So this is a very cost-effective way to drop shot near heavy cover, because that fish grabs it. This is swinging around. He might be out of the cover, but your line is doing this and it gets wrapped around something. And because, like I said, I tie an overhand knot at the top of there, because typically I'm fishing where I'm not expecting to lose my weight. I'm fishing in areas where I know what's in front of me or coming back to my boat. So that's something to look forward when you're sitting out at the top of your boat and working it back in, or you're on the bank and you're coming back. Just something to be aware of. But heavy cover, just as effective. You can dangle it around, all that. And you don't even necessarily need to go all the way down to the bottom. You can use this as a vertical presentation. You don't need to hit the bottom. That's just your weight. But now you have a kind of a different presentation. Whereas you have a jig head kind of pulling, your lure over. And when this is going to sit up, when it gets into current and this is nice and soft and very light, this is actually going to kind of pulsate, parallel to the bottom. It's going to stay in that horizontal position while fishing from a vertical, which sometimes for finicky fish, that might pick off more fish than your typical drop straight down with the jig head, just because of the presentation of the bait. So always having a few different quick, easy ways to fish with the same exact baits, just in a subtle difference in presentation, can be a huge difference on a day on the water during the pre-spawn and during the post-spawn. But there's that weak window when they're pre-spawn into spawning where you can kind of throw the kitchen sink at them. We're at 310 now, so I've gone through all of my major talking points for it. I mean, all of these fishing courses that we've done, We could talk about drop shotting for 2 hours on different types of structures. So this is just kind of a basic overview. These courses are set up to, provide information that is, has been tried, has been effective, but you're going to find your own fishing styles, and taking these as just kind of base parameters to know that if I do these things, most of the time I'm going to be successful. But I can't fish every single body of water in the state at every single location, to be able to tell you. I wish I could. I'd love to get to that point. Maybe when I'm 60 years old, I'll have fished every single spot in the state and I'll be able to answer some of those questions. But just applying those basic techniques and principles anywhere you go, you're going to be more successful. It's just helpful on new bodies of water, but bodies of water that and very well, and where fish are at, it's a great time to try different tactics. If you fish with, a straight stick bobber that's got, an attachment to hold it on, maybe try a slip cork, maybe try slip corking, or try a drop shot presentation instead of just a jig when where fish are at. Because, if you go on a trip somewhere where you haven't been before, you obviously want to get on fish as quickly as possible. But in areas where you have fish, try new things. Not necessarily different baits, use the same baits in different presentations. Because some days, crappie they're finicky. The pre-spawn, they're usually pretty consistent all the way up through the spawn. And that's why this is the most popular time of year from March through April for anglers to fish in Oklahoma. It's just, you can throw most things and be successful. But there are still going to be days in that stretch where there's a high pressure system and the fish are just kind of, but they're still going to want to eat. So switching the presentation, not necessarily the actual offering, can go a long ways. So doing that on bodies of water that well will just open up your repertoire when you go to a new body of water and you need to try a lot of different things to dial in what exactly it is they're looking for. Let's see where we got time. Now's your time to ask questions. Once I get through the last of the questions, we're going to go ahead and sign off here. So if there's anything I missed or you want more detail on, I've got all the time in the world to sit on here and talk. So, but answer your questions. And if I get to the end of them and we haven't had any more questions, we're going to go ahead and sign off. I appreciate everybody for being on here. We can't do this without you. We hope that this is good information for everybody. We want you to be successful. That's whatever brand, hook, whatever you use, it makes, we can give recommendations, but our recommendations are going to be based on just the actual structure of the bait, of the hook, and, what is going to make the most sense. But you're going to find what works best for you. And that's what we want. We want you to be successful. There's nothing more fun than being able to catch fish at times of the year, beyond this, when it gets slower and more people are not catching as many fish. That is when you really start to excel as an angler and fish more often, because you feel more confident that you can go out there. Hey, I never thought of trying this technique. I go to the lake where I typically don't. Oh man, this thing works. So that's where we want you guys to, have every opportunity to get that information. And we're continuing to build our fishing resources page on our website to provide you with as much information as possible that's tailored for Oklahoma to be as consistent over the course of time. You can go to any bait shop, find any, avid angler, any professional tournament angler. They're going to tell you, a different color or a different size or thing, but it's all based around kind of the same common principles. And that's the most fun part of fishing. So can you set up 2 hooks on a line for us? So yeah, you can basically just do what I just did with the drop shot. There's a lot of different ways that you can attach line. The thing is, with monofilament, attaching multiple hooks or having to create essentially a knot on your line with monofilament, sometimes you can get a break if you don't, tie the hook on properly, because a quick, easy way to do it, and it's kind of difficult on anything under, like, this is an 1/8 ounce jig head. But if you wanted to run multiple hooks, do like you're going to do a Palomar knot, you made a loop like that where you've gone through the eyelid, but instead of making an overhand, knot and going through the Palomar knot and then tying it on, just take your loop that you just created and then just run it over the tip of your hook point. So you've just made a loop and then just pull that tight and you can actually get that off. So now we have one on, and now if I want to keep going down the line, put as many, jig head hooks as I can fit on there, I can, get the line through, but that's just looping it over and then going down the line, and you'll get, multiple sets on there. But again, running, if you do a Palomar knot, you can do that a lot of different ways. That's a very simple, basic way that will avoid, maybe line snappage when you get too many knots. The more knots you have on, like if anybody on here fly fishes, you get a bunch of wind knots on there, all of a sudden you lose the durability because it's creating tension at different points on the line as opposed to one point of contact with the hook and the rod tip, and that's it. You put knots in between. If they get different types of tension at different times, you can pop the hook. But you could also kind of made a mess with the line here. You could do the same thing as you did on the, for the drop shot and just tie a Palomar knot on there, run it back through one side of the hook. So maybe it comes out, these hooks are meant to kind of hang sideways. They make different types of jig heads and things that are more apt to be hung at a vertical presentation. But if you wanted to run, an easy way to do it without jig heads to put a bunch of stuff on your line is just run multiple drop shot hooks down. So we did that one. We got a bunch of tag end because we wanted, 2 foot. We'll take a little bit more line and then do a Palomar knot, attach your hook, go down a foot, another Palomar knot, run the line back through, and then your weight. And then you don't have any jig heads or anything close to your line because those jig heads are going to work against your line. I mean, you basically have a weight up against your line. So using a non-weighted hook, you could go down and attach multiple hooks. But lots of people I've seen hooks attached to line in so many different ways, and so many different people are effective, with just different techniques. So there's really no one right way to fish. So again, one of the awesome things about fishing, there's no right or wrong way to do it. You figure out what type of angler you are, what you want to catch, how you want to catch, and then you go from there. With a lake full of standing timber, the best place right now would be along the creek channels. Yeah, your breaks, you're looking for differences in bottom structure. So if you have a ton of timber, well, from the surface, all that timber looks the same. But yeah, if you are out on the water and you can use your electronics, find those contour breaks. What standing timber happened that, the riparian zone, a creek ran through. So they're one of those flooded trees that happens to be right up against that drop. That one right now probably is holding more fish because they're out in that deeper water. Now they'll work their way up those. But yeah, definitely out in the creek channel. If everything is standing timber, identify the trees that are different than all the other ones because of that bottom structure. I think that brings us to the last of the questions. I can see the amount of people that are in here. So typically what I've done on these is if you're done with your questions, I don't have anything else to add. I'll stay here as long as it takes to answer any questions that come up. But if you're good, if you've heard everything you need to hear, if you just go ahead and just jump off the chat, because then once I get down to 0 people, we'll end the stream. And then this video will be available on our website about 10 minutes after this presentation is over with. It'll be on our fishing resources page. And then there you can find our archive and then the email that was sent you for this presentation with that link. So all of these courses are available. I'm always available. So on those pages, my contact information is listed, my phone number, my email. Typically during the week, it's going to go, I'll get a voicemail, I'll call you back. Email is typically if you need a quick answer, especially on the weekend, shoot me an email. I check my email a few times, morning, afternoon, night on the weekend if anglers have questions. I know not everybody has the luxury to go fish on a Tuesday afternoon. So, we're a Monday through Friday agency. But I'm there for all of you if you need help with fishing, because more than likely if it's a Saturday or Sunday, I'm fishing too. So I love sharing information with everybody. I love to hear about what other people are doing and catching fish. So Anytime you have any questions, please don't feel like you're burdening me. I learn something new every time that, I talk to somebody. So always reach out if you have any questions. The next course coming up is going to be in 2 weeks, and it's going to be talking about spawning white bass. So our upcoming courses, we have our state archery shoot is going on right now for elementary and middle school and high school kids. The grand national or the grand shoot for our state shoot. So all of our schools that are in our national archery shooting program, they're competing today and tomorrow, and then we have our scholastic shooting sports. So our shotgun shoots are coming up. So I had to move some of my courses around. Typically we do one each month, but there's going to be 2 in March, one on March 9th, and then the other one I believe is March 30th. But the next one is spawning white bass. And then the other one at the end of March is going to be spawning black bass. So pretty much just going to be talking largemouth bass on that one, kind of like what we just did today. And then the previous course that we did last month was pre-spawn bass fishing tips. That's available in our archive. So that information is good right now. When we get towards the end of next month, that information is still going to be good, but we're going to be transitioning into the largemouth bass spawn. So that course will be pretty similar to this. We'll just be talking largemouth bass. And then the one in 2 weeks will be spawning white bass. Then in May, we have a sunfish course. And then in June, we have a catfish course. And that's as far out as we are. But we'll, here in the next couple of months, you'll see the schedule released for July through December for those upcoming courses. So I don't see any more questions on here, so I'll give it a second or so, and then I'm going to go ahead and sign off. So if you don't have anything else, if you wouldn't mind just clicking out, and I appreciate y'all being here. So I'm going to go ahead and end this stream. If you're typing a question and I can't get to it, just send it over to my email and I'll respond, or shoot me a call or text. The number that's listed for me on our website is a mobile number. So if you don't want to call, you can text as well, and that's also a better way to get a quick response from me, email or text. If you want some more detail, typically it'll go to my voicemail, and then I'll call you back in the evenings when people are off work. So, a lot of subject matter takes, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. But if you just have a quick question on a text or email, I can get right back to you on that stuff. So appreciate everybody for being here. Stay safe. Remember, the outdoors are always open, and fishing's about to get really good. So everybody in here should be excited and happy. So tight lines, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.